Welcome back, everyone, to the River Institute's River Symposium. This afternoon, we're starting with Finn Donnelly, so if you've come for this talk, you're in the right place. Before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So my name is Lee McGahey, and I'm with the River Institute, and we have a chat box which you can join the presentation in. If you can please put your name and where you're from in the chat box, that's always nice for the people that are speaking so they know who's attending the talk. But also more importantly maybe is that if you want to ask any questions, please put those questions in the chat box, and I or whoever is moderating the session will relay those questions to the speaker. So we have 2 more sessions this afternoon. This session is from 1 until 3 o'clock. And we have a last session starting at 3 o'clock and ending at 4:30. If you're attending and you've been on the website, please also go and have a look at the posters that we have. And we have some virtual booths from Community Day yesterday, which have some links to video footage, which are also good to go and visit. So with that, I'm going to get started with this afternoon's presentation. Finn Donnelly, he's the founder and chair of the Rivershed Society of British Columbia. From 1990 to 2000, he made 14 environmental marathon swims covering more than 3,200 kilometers in BC's rivers, lakes and ocean, including twice swimming 1,400 kilometer length of the Fraser River. And he did these swims in an effort to draw attention to the declining health of the water bodies and to encourage communities to engage in environmental advocacy. So Finn served as a member of the Chilcotin City Council from 2002 to 2009, and he was a member of Parliament for Port Moody Coquitlam and New Westminster Coquitlam from 2009 to 2019. While in the House of Commons, he founded the All-Party Oceans Caucus. As an NDP fisheries and oceans critic, Finn introduced many bills to protect West Coast waters, including legislation to ban oil tankers off BC's coasts, transition West Coast open net salmon farms to land-based, close containment, and ban the importation of shark fins to Canada, which became law in 2019. So we welcome Finn today to the River Institute's River Symposium, and I've been connecting with Finn for a while because we had originally scheduled to have this symposium in person back in May, and we were really sorry, Finn, that we weren't able to have you there in person in May. We had to, of course, turn the symposium online. And here we are today, and thank you for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to you to get started with the presentation. I'll be taking a few seconds to pull it up, so I'm going to hand over to you for now.
Great, thank you very much, Lee. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation here in British Columbia. So as Lee mentioned, my name is Finn Donnelly. I am the chair and founder of the Rivershed Society of British Columbia. And I'd like to thank the River Institute for hosting this important event and for inviting me. And as Lee mentioned, that I'm coming to you from BC, the West Coast, via Teams. And thankfully, we have the use of technology during COVID here. That's impacting all of us and all of our work. I'd also like to thank all of you for taking part in today's important event and for the good work that you and your organizations do every day. So I have about a 20 to 25 minute formal presentation. I'd like to leave about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and I really find that the Q&A is often one of the best places for knowledge exchange. So as Lee mentioned, I encourage you to please jot down your questions in the chat box or write them down during my presentation, and then we can discuss them in the Q&A. And I'll start off with a little bit of background. I know Lee mentioned some things, so I might repeat a few things in my background, but I want to give you a chronological order of some of the events that have shaped my life. So I started I got my start working on water issues back in 1989 after graduating from the University of Victoria. As Lee mentioned, from 1990 to 2000, that decade, I made 14 environmental marathon swims. So I was a swimmer. Obviously, I swam competitively for Canada, and I transferred that in pool experience into open water swimming for the environment. So I took a skill that I had and combined it with my passion. And I did these 14 marathon swims during the decade. And that included swimming 4 times across Georgia Strait, once across Wandafuka Strait, and then twice the length of the Fraser River. So that first Fraser River swim is really the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life and what changed my life. And in 1996, so a year later, I founded the Rivershed Society of BC. And later in the presentation, I'll explain our vision, mission, and the goals that we have. In 1997, I was, the Squamish Nation honored my stewardship work by welcoming me to their family and naming me Iem Yoyos, which means strong swimmer in the animal world, or orca. So it's a huge honor that I wear to this day, and I wear that proudly, and it's a big responsibility. And the reason they gave me the name orca was orca, for whales to be plentiful, they need salmon. They feed on salmon. So that was the connection that the elders decided that I was like the orca, the caretaker of the sea. It relies on salmon, and my work on the Fraser, one of the greatest salmon systems on the planet, is very connected. So it's a really fitting name because, as Lee mentioned, some of my work has been focused on the ocean, and of course, much of it with Rivershed Society has been freshwater systems. Just mentioning about the 2000 swim, or the Fraser River swim that I did in the year 2000, it was a millennial event. I reswam the Fraser River for 2 reasons. One was to see if the water quality had improved or worsened, and 2 was to see if there was more or fewer advocates for the environment. And that was the 2 measurements we used on that second swim. We had a team of scientists that were on. We had senior scientists paired with junior scientists, and they were doing a number of water quality tests at all the river tributaries that I swam by. And what we found is that water quality had, on the Fraser, had improved in some areas, like the upper Fraser, namely Prince George and Quesnel, where pulp effluent went right into the river, and raw sewage. In fact, through the 90s, there was still raw sewage going in, but the federal government had done a program to upgrade many of those municipal sewer systems to secondary treatment. So that had definitely improved by 2000, and some of the pulp effluent had also been taken out of the system. So that had improved the water quality. But in the lower Fraser, there was a different story. It was actually as bad, if not worse, mainly due to the CSOs, or the combined sewer overflows, that had still, because of increased population and urban development and more commercial activity, there was definitely an increase of pollutants going into the lower Fraser. So kind of good news, bad news on the water quality. In terms of the advocacy, it had definitely improved. So just over 5 years, we had way more people attend the event, be involved with the event. This was over 3 weeks at 25 different community celebrations, we called them, from headwaters of the Fraser right down to Vancouver, the sea. So we really noticed an increase in a number of people, and this was 20 years ago. So that was over 5 years. So those are the 2 metrics that we use to measure improvement. And that completed for me a decade of doing those swims. In 2002, as Lee mentioned, I turned to public policy and got involved with politics. I ran for Coquitlam Council, got elected, ran 2 other times. So I ran locally, and the municipality that I'm in, Coquitlam, is really on the front lines of salmon habitat. So it's a real battle between replacing salmon habitat with human habitat. So housing, we're in a growing community, and that battle continues today. And I think really all over the planet, as we try to accommodate for human habitat at the expense of wilderness or wild habitat. That I think is the balance that we need to focus on to get towards a sustainable way of life. And then in 2009, I ran federally and became a member of Parliament. And as Lee mentioned, did a number of bills and focused on environmental protection at the federal level. And then to cap off the introduction, this past Saturday, I was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly in British Columbia here. So I'm very excited to take the work that I've done as a city councillor at the local level and a member of Parliament at the federal level, and now focus it in British Columbia on a lot of the environmental concerns that I've been working on over the past 17 years politically, and 31 years since my advocacy started out of UVic. So that's a little bit about me. And so next slide. And I'll talk about water and a little bit about what we're focused on at the Rivershed Society. So Canada is blessed with an abundance of fresh water. However, many issues threaten the health of these waterways, including climate change, pollution, and habitat loss, to name just a few. We need to address these threats if we want to live sustainably. And I think that's possible. That's why I've spent the past 31 years as an advocate, an educator, and elected official, raising awareness, educating the public, and fighting to implement better environmental public policy. I believe we can transform our communities to adopt sustainable practices, but we must use all the tools in our toolbox to make this happen, including conservation, protection, restoration, good science, public education, and better public policy at all levels. So today I'm going to talk about how the Rivershed Society of BC is using Watershed CPR to heal and protect the Fraser Watershed. So next slide. So I want to give you a bit of context about the Fraser Watershed. Some of you may be familiar about this large watershed in Canada, in British Columbia on the west coast, and others may not. So I think it's always really important to provide a bit of context about the landscape, the waterscape that we're focused on. So the Fraser is known, as I mentioned earlier, as one of the most productive salmon systems on the planet. So really a lot of people know the Fraser as a salmon river. Its diverse watershed covers 10 of BC's 14 biogeoclimatic zones, which is amazing. So that means it's a very, very diverse watershed. In fact, one of the most diverse watersheds in North America. It drains 21 million hectares. So it's a large watershed. It's the size of Great Britain. It's to give you some scale, it's a large watershed, and that's about a quarter of British Columbia. A third of BC's 5 million residents or people live within its boundaries. 2/3 of BC's economy is generated in the Fraser Watershed. It is a Canadian and a British Columbia heritage river. It is one of the few remaining main stem rivers in the world that has not been dammed. Its watershed contains a complex and vibrant ecosystem supporting species, 57 other fish species, more than 300 kinds of birds, and dozens of mammals, including grizzly bears, caribou, and moose. People, communities, and wildlife depend on the Fraser and its 34 riversheds for their prosperity and survival. The health of the Fraser Watershed is essential to the health of British Columbia. the two are intertwined, and that's critical. So having a very healthy Fraser watershed, which was fundamental to Indigenous peoples, started since the last ice age, and now bringing a recent development of European settlement and even more recently Asian settlement. It's cultures are diverse, the landscape is diverse, the ecosystem is very diverse, and it's also an excellent unit to measure the health of a region. So that's one of the reasons why we focus on watersheds. So next slide. So at the Rivershed Society BC, we have divided the Fraser's 34 riversheds because it's a large region into 6 distinct subregions. We call those regions, but they are all hydrologically based. So it's all based on water and water drainage, so watersheds. In other words, each region is made up of distinct watersheds, or as we call them, riversheds. So I'll quickly introduce the regions to set the context for RSBC's work. So next slide. So starting in the Fraser headwaters, this is the most northerly region. The Fraser headwaters region is bounded by the Rocky Mountains to the north and the Caribou Mountains to the south. And the Rocky Mountain Trench, or the Robson Valley, which runs between those mountain ranges, contains many intact valleys with old growth and ancient forests, some trees as old as 2,000 years. And it also, that area contains many intact valleys with old growth, important grizzly bear habitat. But it is threatened by industrial logging and agriculture. This particular region, as you can see on the slide, consists of, it's a bit difficult to see on the slide, but it has 14 different river tributaries or riversheds that all feed into the main stem Fraser. So those 14 riversheds are what we work on with community partners. So next slide. So the next area or region is the Nachko region to the west of the Fraser and the west of Prince George. This region is bounded by the coast mountains. So the coast mountains are the height of land that push the water towards the Fraser. And it's home to the endangered white sturgeon. This region consists of one massive rivershed, the Nachko, that drains into the Fraser. And it is the second largest rivershed in the entire Fraser watershed. So next slide. The Caribou Chilcotin region includes the fishing highway, originally used by the Shoeswap people as a trade route. It's an important region for preserving and creating wildlife corridors between protected areas, which will help the recovery of endangered mountain caribou. So the Chilcotin part of the Caribou Chilcotin, which is on the west side of the Fraser, consists of vast wilderness with very high wildlife and plant values. And this region consists of 5 river tributaries or riversheds. So next slide. So the Thompson Shoeswap, which is below the Caribou Chilcotin region, contains the world famous Adams River with one of the largest sockeye salmon runs on the planet. And every 4th year is the dominant year, or the dominant salmon run, which can usually bring millions of fish. I say usually because in the last few years we've had extremely poor returns. And we are worried about sockeye salmon going the way of the Atlantic cod if we don't act. Well, we need to have acted a while ago, but the important focus to the federal government, which is currently looking at doing a study on wild Pacific salmon, they need to act now. And that was the message I brought to the standing committee to say, we are on the brink of losing these amazing animals if we don't act now. However, even with against all odds, it's runs like the Adams River that still see incredible returns of sockeye, and you'll see them usually return late September to the end of October. So right about now, they're all coming back. This region, the Thompson Shoeswap, it is one of the two anomalies. It consists of one massive rivershed, and it is the largest rivershed in the Fraser Watershed. So it's a huge area, the Thompson and the North Thompson, that drain right into the Fraser. So next slide. So the fifth region is the Fraser Canyon region, and it contains the world famous Hell's Gate and the Stein Valley World Heritage Site. So if you've ever come to Vancouver and you want to get out to an amazing area just 2 hours north of Vancouver, you can ride the tram car at Hell's Gate and see this very narrow section of the canyon. And in fact, it's where the CP rail was building at the turn of the last century, and rock debris from the blasting of the railway was allowed to just pile into the river, and it actually caused a blockage. If it wasn't for First Nations transporting the fish around, we would have lost entire runs of salmon. So that was one, and I'll mention, I'll mention in a second, after a couple of features about the Fraser Canyon, what happened just recently. So this region consists of diverse ecosystems, from old growth interior Douglas fir to sage-grass deserts. And it consists of 6 river tributaries or riversheds. Last year in this region, and this is what I was referring to, a massive rock slide, a natural rock slide, happened at Big Bar, which is just north of Lillooet, and that prevented salmon from traveling upstream. In fact, the federal government has been focused on this issue, and they have spent over $50 million trying to create fish passage and get those fish upstream. And they have had some success, and I do thank the federal government for making this a priority. But there is so much more work that needs to be done if we want to maintain these salmon runs. So next slide. So the final region that completes the Fraser Watershed is the Lower Fraser region, which stretches from Hope to the Salish Sea, which is Vancouver and Richmond. And it provides some of the most critical habitat for all 5 species of salmon. Although developed with major cities, there are still large undeveloped areas that provide opportunities to protect wilderness within this ecosystem. This is a very complex region because of the development, urban development, and the amount of industry that happens, but also because there's some incredible wilderness still, if you can believe it, in this stretch. And there's a focus right now on protecting what's called the heart of the Fraser in the Fraser Valley. So there are areas in which are critical to wildlife and salmon habitat. It's in the estuary. It's one of the most important flyovers, stopovers for birds in North America. So you have this incredible complex, a diverse array of people living here, wildlife, salmon and birds, and you have the economy being generated in this area. So it's a critical area. And later in the presentation, I'm going to refer to some of the work that we're doing in the Lower Fraser, because there actually is currently quite a bit of momentum focused on the Lower Fraser. And there are many nations, up to 30 First Nations that their traditional territory is in the Lower Fraser. So again, adding to the complexity in many municipalities. So next slide. So that's an overview of the Fraser, of the different regions. And now we'll turn to the threats that the Fraser in total faces, and really its cumulative impacts. But The threats include climate change, probably the most dominant issue on the planet. And this is, we're seeing increased frequency of floods, wildfires, droughts, and beetle infestations. So it's amazing, within a month, you can go from a fire to a flood situation. That didn't happen certainly often, and it is happening with increasing frequency over the last 5 to 10 years. So we are definitely seeing the impacts of climate change, including warmer river water for salmon trying to make it upstream, incredibly difficult. Urban development, this is a growing region with a growing population requiring more land for human communities, is another big threat. Also outside of the river or the watershed is open net salmon farms, which impact wild salmon, Fraser River salmon, sockeye, and others that run up Vancouver Island, which is where the majority of those open net salmon farms are, that really release a lot of the chemicals and pollutants and pesticides right into the ocean, and the sea lice that are associated with those open net farms attached to the juvenile salmon, and have major impacts on survival of those salmon. Of course, there's industrial resource use like mining, logging, and agriculture, as well as huge water withdrawals for industry that all impact the Fraser, its wildlife, and its health. So these activities cause loss of habitat for wildlife or result in pollutants being added to the watershed and impact human health. So next slide. So after my first swim the length of the Fraser River, as I mentioned, I formed the Rivershed Society of British Columbia in 1996. And we've been actively delivering public education programs, community initiatives, and building stewardship capacity within the Fraser Watershed for almost 25 years now. So next slide. So just a bit about our vision. And I think this is really important to have, you know, a very positive focus of, because a lot of environmental organizations or advocacy or conservation groups can be seen as, you know, doom and gloom. And so I think it's very important to project a positive image and vision of where we're trying to get to. So our vision is a Fraser watershed becoming the most resilient watershed on the planet, with salmon, people, and economies flourishing in rivershed communities. So next slide. So with that vision in mind, we have a mission. And our mission, I think, is fairly simple. It's to conserve, protect, and restore the Fraser's 34 riversheds. And we've got a 10-year plan, and we're focused on that particular goal of Watershed CPR, which I'll get to explaining in a second. So, but first, next slide. I'd like to explain, we have developed 3 goals, all focused on the C, P, and R, so the CPR. Our first goal is we want to mobilize 100,000 watershed defenders to conserve the Fraser watershed by 2030. So ideally, 10,000, we want to sign up 10,000 watershed defenders a year for the next 10 years. That's our focus, because we believe with those people, supporters, defenders, we will be able to affect our other 2 goals, which I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of what is a watershed defender? A watershed defender commits to conserving, protecting, and restoring watersheds. So we call this Watershed CPR. So that's what a watershed defender will do, conservation being the broadest term, protection being very specific, and restoring being quite specific to watershed restoration, watershed protection. Conservation being good science, education, public policy, all of the important things that are often harder to measure. So next slide. So our second goal focuses on protecting 30% or 7 million hectares of the Fraser watershed by 2030. So currently there's 18% of the Fraser watershed that is legally protected. So 30% is the IUCN goal, and it's an international goal that Canada has adopted, and I believe that the province of British Columbia has adopted and is moving to protect 30% of the land base. So for us, protecting 30% of the Fraser watershed makes a lot of sense. There's already buy-in. There is an argument that nature needs half, so that 30% may be a good starting point, but we need to obviously increase that if we're to be successful with a changing climate. However, that's our goal for now, which means with 18% protected, we need to protect additional 12% in every all of the 6 regions. So it could be 2% in every region, or there could be certain regions that we find that there is an ability to protect more. But the goal would be to try to protect 7 million hectares of the Fraser by 2030. So next slide. Our final goal, and these are really important because having a vision is great, having a mission helps you focus, but the goals are very specific and they allow us to measure all of our programs. So our final goal is looking at restoring 5% or 1 million hectares of the Fraser by 2030. So very, very specific on protection, restoration, and conservation. So next slide. So we know that healthy watersheds play an essential role in providing ecosystem services, which benefit people and all living things and sustain our communities and economies. Through RSBC's programming, we work with people and communities to conserve, protect, and restore the Fraser watershed. We call this Watershed CPR, and it's the framework within which we deliver all of our programs. Watershed CPR uses nature-based solutions and applies a proactive, preventative healthcare approach to critical watershed health issues. So by protecting watersheds, communities may reduce, even eliminate their costly restorative actions or the need for costly restorative actions. We don't see that happening in the near future because there's so much work, especially in the lower Fraser, that needs to be done on restoring wildlife habitat, salmon habitat, and many nations and municipalities and stewardship groups are already engaged, excuse me, in restoring their territory. So that's we want to work with those nations, with those municipalities, with those stewardship groups to advance their goals, whether it's restoration or protection or conservation. So next slide. Let's get a sip of water. So critical to successfully implementing Watershed CPR is the development of regional hubs. And we want to develop a regional hub in all 6 regions of the Fraser watershed. So each regional hub will develop its own Watershed CPR plan, including the development of specific watershed campaigns to target specific watersheds that will mobilize communities and engage leaders. And those are the 3 main areas of our programming: watershed campaigns, mobilizing communities, and engaging leaders to achieve specific protection and restoration targets. So one of those plans will identify what are the protection targets for that region, what are the restoration targets, if any, for that region. And some regions, for instance, in the Fraser headwaters, they're not interested in restoration, they're very interested in protection. And in the lower Fraser, there's a lot of focus on restoration, and it's harder for the protection gains. So again, it has to be very custom to the particular region that we're working in. When all these watershed CPR plans are stitched together, they will form a watershed-wide effort aimed at transforming the Fraser into the most resilient watershed on the planet. That's our goal, and that's why we're focused on developing each region together with different partners. So we have begun our work in the lower Fraser region, As I mentioned, a very complex region with where there's a lot of people, a lot of industry, a lot of interests, and a lot at stake. So we started there because there is significant momentum to develop a coordinated plan. The federal government has pulled out since 2015, 2013 actually. And there really has been an absence of a coordinated plan. We used to have what was called FREMP, or the Fraser River Estuary Management Program, that did a good job of focusing on where the key wildlife habitat is and where the development, if it was to occur, could happen with the least impact to wildlife. Losing that program was a big loss for a coordinated plan. So what we found is the third sector and First Nations are stepping up to provide that void. And so we are working with a number of partners to develop a watershed plan. Next slide. I want to focus on a few of our programs just to finish off. So we're working with the UBC Sustainability Scholars Program and the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance and other partners in the Lower Fraser on the development of a restoration projects and priorities story map that envisions a restored Lower Fraser. It will include a series of graphic renderings which will tell the story of a resilient Lower Fraser. By incorporating scientific and Indigenous knowledge, this project will clearly illustrate a coordinated vision of the Lower Fraser restoration project's priorities and opportunities, resulting in increased public support and capital investment for further Lower Fraser restoration. This innovative project will provide a tool for NGOs, municipalities, First Nations, the province, and DFO to showcase a vision of a restored Lower Fraser. Next slide. And in response to COVID-19, which completely turned our world and our programming upside down this year, we are developing and will be implementing the Watershed CPR education program focused on the Fraser Estuary. This program will provide youth and adults with online learning opportunities about the importance of estuaries and watersheds. Participants will learn about the Fraser Watershed, how to apply Watershed CPR, and the significance of the Fraser Estuary to the Musqueam Indian Band. The purpose of the program is to increase awareness and educate about the importance of the Fraser Watershed with a focus on fish habitat in the estuary and how to become a watershed defender. And it'll help participants gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of estuaries, threats they face, and encourage them in Watershed CPR, to engage in Watershed CPR. So next slide. So the final program I want to share with you is an exciting new tool that we are developing in partnership with the Canadian Mapping Network and Canadian Geographic. The climate crisis can be overwhelming and can seem too big to tackle individually, but collectively communities can create an impact if they have the scientific knowledge, resources, and tools to enable them to make climate conscious choices. So we will develop and implement the Climate Change Resilience and Champions tool, a watershed app, to combat feelings of hopelessness and a lack of initiative around climate change at an individual and community level. So this app will engage people and communities in climate change awareness and action that supports Canada's climate goals, climate change goals, and this digital tool will engage a wide range of participants and will include educational content such as self-led courses on climate change in their communities, actions to reduce emissions and personal climate mitigation actions, a list of actions that they can take to mitigate climate change, as well as ways to get the community involved in climate change impacts that has on GHG emissions. And the topics will include environmental stewardship, energy efficient homes and buildings, clean transportation, supporting eco-friendly local businesses, and supporting local food options. It'll be a web-based form and with an interactive map and statistics showing climate change actions by their community. So next slide. So I'd like to finish my formal part of the presentation talking a bit about the importance of partnerships. By building partnerships in the Fraser Watershed, which we have been doing for the past 25 years, we're able to amplify our impact. And our partners play a key role in the success of our regional watershed CPR hubs. To give you an idea of groups we're working with, here are some of the organizations we are currently working with in the Lower Fraser. I mentioned Canadian Geographic. We've entered into a 10-year strategic partnership with CanGeo to inspire an ethic of conservation and protection in the Fraser Watershed, using a number of Royal Canadian Geographic Society's well-established communication streams. And we're also working with Raincoast Conservation Foundation's team of conservationists and scientists to conserve, protect, and restore the Lower Fraser. We're working with the First Nation Fisheries Council, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, the Musqueam Indian Band, many other First Nations in the Lower Fraser to develop and deliver our Watershed CPR education program and our Lower Fraser Restoration Story Map. We're working with an exciting team, Nerve Productions, who are a duo of young videographers creating informative films. We call them Rivershed Stories for broadcast. We're also working with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, UBC, BCIT Rivers Institute, labor organizations, local businesses, Metro Vancouver Regional District, municipalities, the province, the feds, and many environmental organizations. Finally, we've just recently entered a conversation with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts about working with them on expanding our water quality monitoring through the use of citizen science. And we recently met with a group called Only One, which is a platform in the US working on amplifying the work of organizations like Rivershed Society, and they have an audience of 10 million followers. So final slide is, so to summarize, RSBC is using a watershed CPR framework to build a constituency of thousands of watershed defenders who will help protect 30% and restore 5% of the Fraser Watershed by 2030 and put it on a path to becoming the most resilient watershed on the planet. So that is my formal presentation, and hopefully there's a few minutes left for questions that you might have. Lee, do we have time for questions?
Finn, you've already gone 2 minutes over your allotted time, but you've got great questions in here, and I hope Christina Charette will forgive me for just at least letting you attempt to answer one or maybe two, depending on how quick you can make your answers.
I'll be short.
First of all, Ben, thank you. That was really wonderful. I spent 7 years in BC out in Vancouver, and I guess I have a soft spot for the Fraser River, and to hear you talking about it, and I learned a lot in your presentation, which is really great, and I'm excited to hear about all the work that you're doing. So Anastasia asked a question. She says she's with Lintha Law, participating from Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory on land subject to the so-called Crawford's Purchase, which was from 1783, in the Cataraqui River watershed. Thanks for the amazing virtual tour of the Fraser Watershed. I'm curious about the legally protected measure, and she put that in inverted commas. Can you tell us more about what this requires? Are there often exemptions from protections, or are the protections aren't fully implemented, enforceable?
That's a great question, and I'll do a very short answer in that the 18% of the Fraser that currently enjoys protection, generally you cannot change that. It is protected by law, whether it's federal or mostly provincial, but there is some even local protection. But the way forward really is through, I believe, is through IPCA. So Indigenous protection and conservation areas, I feel, is where we're going to get the biggest gains in the Fraser to try to secure that 12 or more %. So really it's through working with Indigenous communities, First Nations. That's where I think we're going to have real protection, real meaningful protection. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully that is. I would love to discuss more. I know, I'm sorry I went over time. I wanted to leave more time for questions, but please, through Lee, send those questions, and I'd be happy to engage further as the Rivershed Society or myself. And I really apologize for going over, and but thank the Rivers Institute for hosting this event. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks a lot, Finn. I'm going to put one more to you, but it's just a yes or no answer. Will the CPR education program be offered through schools or institutions, or will it be open to anyone willing to learn?
Yes, we're gonna start with schools and expand there. And the idea of working with CanGeo is eventually ideally taking it out of the Fraser and beyond. So stay tuned.
Okay, and that addresses another question where someone's asking, you know, is it just the Fraser, or are you looking at riversheds across Canada? So that addresses.
We are definitely starting with the Fraser, and it's a huge amount of work. But you know, if we develop something that can be used in other watersheds, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut us off there. Sorry, Finn. And